They locked her out in the deadliest blizzard of the century. Beta Thomas told her Omegas were prey dead weight, not worth saving. She had nothing but a freezing cabin and her mother's threadbare shawl. Then she heard scratching at her door. A dying wolf. Then another. Then 15 more, including the most powerful king in existence. What she did next with her last bit of firewood didn't just save their lives. It shattered everything they believed about strength. If this story touched you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. The generators are for the strong. We don't have space or heat for dead weight. Beta Thomas stood on the sprawling porch of the Silver Pine pack house. Golden light spilling over his boots from inside. Elone stood below him in the snow, clutching her mother's faded lavender shawl around her thin shoulders. It was the only warm thing she owned. "Please," she whispered, her breath misting in the frozen air. "The storm is an apex predator." Thomas interrupted, his lip curling. "And Omegas are prey. Stay in your cabin." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The lock clicked. The first flakes of the century's deadliest blizzard began to fall like ash. 3 days later, the wind didn't just howl. It screamed like something dying. Elone pressed her bruised shoulder against the rotting timber of her cabin door, fighting the blizzard that clawed at the frame with invisible, icy fingers. Snow had already drifted halfway up the single cracked window, turning her one-room shack into a claustrophobic tomb of white. Frost crept across the inside of the glass in intricate, jagged patterns. They would have been beautiful if they weren't a death sentence. She pulled her mother's lavender shawl tighter around her neck. The wool was threadbare. The scent of lavender and honey had long faded into the metallic tang of wood smoke and damp earth. But it was her anchor, the only tangible proof that she'd once been loved. Before the sickness took her mother, before the Silver Pine pack relegated her to the lowest rung of existence, Omega, to them, it meant weak, worthless, a punching bag for their frustrations. Elone moved to the small iron stove in the center of the room. Her hands, wrapped in torn cloth, trembled as she stirred a pot of water. A few sad, wrinkled root vegetables floated in the pale broth. It was her last meal. She'd burned through half her chopped firewood just to keep the temperature above freezing. If she died out here, they wouldn't find her until the spring thaw. They'd look at her frozen body and shrug. Weak wolf. Couldn't survive the winter. She lifted a wooden spoon to her cracked lips, letting the meager warmth slide down her throat. Her inner wolf, a small, timid presence that usually curled into a tight, frightened ball, let out a soft, restless whine. Then she heard it, a sound beneath the deafening roar of the wind. Scratching. Weak. Rhythmic. Desperate. Elone froze. Her spoon clattered against the rim of the pot. Scratch. Pause. Whine. It was at the base of her door. Something was out there in the whiteout. Something alive. Don't be stupid, she told herself, her heart hammering. Opening the door meant letting the sub-zero wind blast into her sanctuary. It could extinguish her fragile fire. It could rip the door right off its rusted hinges. It was suicide, but the scratching came again, followed by a sound she knew intimately, the broken, breathless whimper of a creature that knew it had been abandoned. She remembered standing outside the pack house, her fingers numb, begging to be let in. She knew the exact flavor of that terror before her survival instincts could stop her. Elone dropped the spoon. She grabbed the iron handle, braced her boots against the floorboards, and pulled. The blizzard exploded into the cabin with the force of a physical blow. Snow blasted her face, blinding her instantly. The cold was so absolute, it felt like fire, burning her exposed skin and stealing the oxygen from her lungs. She squinted through the violent curtain of white there. Half buried in a rising snowdrift on her threshold lay a wolf. It was massive. Its thick coat was crusted with ice, and its chest barely moved. Elone dropped to her knees, the snow soaking instantly through her thin pants. The wolf lifted its heavy head. Amber eyes met hers, dull, pain-filled, but still burning with desperate intelligence. "No, you're not dying here," Elone gasped. She shoved her frozen hands under the beast's front legs. It was dead weight, impossibly heavy, easily over 150 pounds of dense muscle and wet fur. Her muscles screamed, her bruised shoulders tearing with the effort. But adrenaline and sheer stubborn defiance fueled her, grunting. She hauled the massive creature over the threshold, dragging it onto her rough wooden floor. Panting. Elone turned back to grab the door handle and slam it shut. She stopped. Her blood turned to ice. Beyond the doorway, emerging from the violent, swirling darkness of the blizzard, were glowing eyes. Dozens of them, great shapes silver, brown, and black materialized through the snow. 14 more wolves, all massive, all swaying on trembling legs, covered in thick sheets of ice. They were following the faint golden light of her fire, the only beacon of warmth in 50 miles of frozen wasteland. Elone stood in the doorway, the lethal wind whipping her hair around her face. Her cabin was barely big enough for one. She had a handful of firewood and half a pot of vegetable water. One of the wolves, a towering beast with fur as black as a starless night, stumbled forward and collapsed directly at her boots. Its golden eyes rolling back, the massive black wolf lay motionless across her threshold, a wall of frozen muscle and wet fur, blocking the door from closing. Asterisk, you don't have room for dead weight. Beta Thomas's voice echoed in Elone's mind, a cruel, sharp memory. Asterisk, stay where you belong. Elone gritted her teeth against the memory and the freezing wind. Not today, she whispered. Her voice snatched away by the gale. She dropped to her knees, her fingers raw and bleeding as they dug into the thick ruff of the black wolf's neck. He was easily the largest of the pack, a titan among beasts. Her small omega frame strained under the sheer mass of him. Every muscle in her back and arms screamed. But she planted her boots on the slick floorboards and hauled, "Come on," she grunted, her breath pluming white. Inside. Now. Slowly. Agonizingly. She dragged the black wolf over the threshold. As soon as his hind legs cleared the doorframe, the others began to stumble inside. They were a pathetic sight. Magnificent predators reduced to shivering. Clumsy lumps of ice and snow, moving with the jerky, uncoordinated gait of severe hypothermia. Elone counted them as they practically collapsed into her small space. 3, 5, 9, 12, 14, 15 wolves in total. Including the black giant, her cabin meant for one was instantly packed wall to wall with wet fur and the sharp metallic smell of cold and wet dog. She threw her entire body weight against the heavy oak door, slamming it shut and throwing the iron bolt. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the ragged, labored breathing of 15 dying animals. "Okay," Elone panted, leaning her forehead against the wood, her whole body shaking. "Okay, think." The temperature in the cabin had plummeted. The blast of Arctic air had nearly snuffed out her fragile fire. If she didn't get them warm immediately, they would all die right here on her floor. She rushed to the stove, throwing her last few logs onto the dying embers. The fire sputtered, then caught, casting a dim orange glow over the sea of fur. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough heat for 15 freezing bodies. Asterisk, body heat. Pile them together. It was a daunting task. Elone was exhausted, starving, bruised, but she moved with frantic purpose. She started with the smaller wolves, dragging them closer to the stove, arranging them in a tight semicircle. They were too weak to resist, too cold to even snap at her. Some watched her with glazed, unseeing eyes. Others were completely unresponsive. A young, sandy-colored male was shivering so violently his teeth clattered against the floorboards. Elone dragged him next to a massive brown wolf, pressing their bodies together. Then she turned to the black wolf. He lay where she dragged him furthest from the fire, his breathing dangerously shallow. His fur was matted with ice crystals, solid patches of frost clinging to his flanks. Elone knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his massive chest. He was intimidating even near death, exuding an aura of raw power that made her inner Omega whimper and tuck its metaphorical tail. But she ignored the instinct. She pressed her palms against his ribs, feeling the slow, sluggish thump of his heart. "Don't you dare die in my house," she whispered fiercely, rubbing her hands vigorously over his frozen fur, trying to stimulate circulation. "I didn't drag you in here just to watch you go." She pulled her mother's lavender shawl off her own shoulders, the only warm thing she possessed, and draped it carefully over the black wolf's back, tucking the edges around his shivering form. The wolf's eyes cracked open. They were not the dull amber of a regular wolf. They were gold, pure molten Gold, piercing and intelligent. For a second, despite the dim light and the freezing cold, those eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that stopped Elone's breath. It wasn't the look of a wild animal. It was the look of someone assessing her, seeing straight through her thin clothes and her bruised soul. Then the golden eyes slowly closed, and the massive chest let out a long, rattling sigh. Elone scrambled up. She couldn't afford to be mesmerized. She needed to hydrate them. She took the small pot of vegetable broth from the stove, her only food, and moved from wolf to wolf. She dipped her fingers into the lukewarm liquid and carefully smeared it over their gums and tongues. Some managed to lap weakly at her fingers. Others simply swallowed the moisture automatically. She worked tirelessly through the night. The wind outside continued its relentless assault, rattling the thin walls of the cabin. But inside, a strange, desperate peace settled over them. She melted snow in the pot, offering water to those who could drink. She rubbed frostbitten paws and ears, her own hands raw and numb. She spoke to them soft, meaningless words of comfort, a steady stream of reassurance that she herself had craved for 14 years. Hours blurred together into one long, agonizing vigil. The firewood dwindled down to glowing coals. Elone, exhausted beyond measure, finally collapsed against the wall near the stove, her knees drawn up to her chest. She looked out over the sea of sleeping wolves. Their breathing had leveled out. The violent shivering had stopped. The ambient temperature in the tiny cabin had risen, fueled by the combined body heat of 15 massive predators. They were alive, all of them, weak, worthless. Beta Thomas's voice echoed faintly in the back of her mind. Elone let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. She, the lowest-ranking Omega, the girl deemed too pathetic to survive, had just pulled 15 lives from the jaws of a century storm. Her eyelids drooped. The exhaustion was absolute. A heavy, dark blanket pulling her under, just before sleep claimed her. She felt a shift in the air, a sudden, overwhelming pressure, that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She forced her eyes open, her heart skipping a beat. The black wolf was awake. He was standing. He towered over the other sleeping forms, his massive head nearly brushing the low ceiling beams, and those molten gold eyes were fixed entirely on her. He didn't look like a wolf recovering from near death. He looked like a king assessing his domain. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the floorboards groaning under his immense weight. Alone's back pressed hard against the wall. She was trapped. The ambient temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees, despite the residual heat radiating from the sleeping pack. The black wolf stood before Alone, an obsidian mountain of muscle and power, his golden eyes unblinking. Every instinct she possessed, 14 years of brutal conditioning at the hands of the Silver Pine Pack, screamed at her to submit. Her inner Omega whimpered, a high-pitched sound of terror, urging her to drop to her knees, to expose her neck, to beg forgiveness for daring to exist in the presence of such overwhelming dominance. This wasn't just a wolf. This was an apex predator. He lowered his massive head, his wet nose inches from her face, the scent of pine needles, ozone, and something wild hit her, a sharp smell that cut through the stale air of the cabin. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He just stared, assessing her with an intelligence that was far too sharp for an animal. Elone forced her spine straight against the rough wood of the wall, fighting the urge to cower. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice rough and trembling. "That's good. You were half dead yesterday." She expected a snarl. She expected him to snap at her. Instead, the wolf let out a slow, rumbling sigh that vibrated through her chest. He leaned forward, his massive head pressing gently against her collarbone, a gesture of undeniable gratitude. The thick fur of his mane was still damp, but warm. Elone gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to bury themselves in the thick ruff of his neck. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that it broke something hard and brittle inside her. "You're welcome," she breathed, her voice cracking. For a long moment, they stayed like that, a fragile peace in the heart of the storm. Then the air shifted again, a crackle of energy, like the static before lightning strikes, filled the small room. The black wolf pulled back, his form blurred, shifting, expanding, and snapping back into focus. The transformation was instantaneous, silent, terrifyingly fast. One moment, Alone was staring at a massive wolf. The next, a man was kneeling on her cabin floor. He was naked, his skin a deep bronze, his muscles starkly defined and corded with power. He was easily 6.5 feet tall, even kneeling broad-shouldered and imposing. His hair was as black as his fur, falling in wild tangles past his shoulders. But it was his eyes that remained unchanged, those impossible, piercing gold eyes that commanded absolute authority. He was the most breathtakingly dangerous man Elone had ever seen. And then she saw the scar, a jagged line of raised silver tissue cut across his left pectoral muscle, a testament to a battle he shouldn't have survived. It was the only flaw on an otherwise perfect, létal physique. He rose slowly, his sheer size dominating the cramped space of her cabin. Elone scrambled backward until she hit the corner of the room, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "You," the man said. His voice was a deep, rough rumble, raw from disuse and the cold. It was the voice of a commander used to absolute obedience. "You're either the bravest Omega I've ever encountered, or the most foolish." Behind him, the cabin erupted in movement. On Ebe 1, the other wolves began to stir, feeling the sudden surge of power. As they woke, They too shifted. In a matter of seconds, 14 naked men and women filled her tiny home. They were all battle-scarred, hard-eyed, and powerfully built, but the moment they shifted, they averted their eyes from the black-haired man, dropping to one knee. Their heads bowed in undeniable submission. Even the massive brown man who'd been shivering violently only hours ago knelt, his chin nearly touching his chest. "My king." A woman with auburn hair and sharp, assessing eyes murmured from the floor, her voice tight with respect. Alone's breath hitched. She stared at the man standing before her, the pieces snapping together with terrifying clarity, the absolute dominance, the golden eyes, the deference of 14 lethal warriors. He wasn't just a pack alpha. He was Kyle Stormborn, the Alpha King of the Five Kingdoms, the most powerful werewolf in existence, and she had dragged him through the snow like a sack of potatoes and force-fed him vegetable water. "Oh, goddess," Alone breathed. Her voice barely a squeak. She scrambled to her knees, frantically trying to bow, to apologize, to do something, anything, to appease the absolute ruler of her kind. "Your Majesty." "I didn't. I had no idea. I'm so sorry." "Stop," Kyle commanded. It wasn't a roar, but the power behind the single word hit Alone like a physical blow. She froze mid-bow, her eyes wide with terror. Kyle took a slow, deliberate step toward her, his golden eyes burning. "Do not apologize," he said softly, his voice a dangerous purr. "And do not kneel." He stopped mere inches away, his towering presence forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. He reached down, his large, calloused hands grasping her thin shoulders. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, but the heat radiating from his skin was overwhelming. He pulled her upright, forcing her to stand before him. "What is your name?" he asked, his eyes roaming over her pale, bruised face, taking in her threadbare clothes and her shivering frame. "Alone," she whispered. "Alone Thornheart, of the Silver Pine Pack." A dark emotion flashed across KL's face. "Silver Pine," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Alpha Donovan's territory." He glanced around the pathetic, freezing shack, noting the empty wood box, the single cracked window, the meager pot of water on the cold stove. "Where is your pack?" "Alone." The question was casual, but the tone was deadly. "Why are you alone in a century storm with barely enough supplies for a single day?" The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Every member of the Royal Guard was watching her now, their expressions unreadable, but their bodies rigid with tension. Alone swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She wanted to lie. She wanted to say she'd chosen to stay, that she was fine, that it was a mistake. But the Alpha King was looking at her with a truth-seeking intensity that made lying impossible. "They didn't want me," she admitted, her voice trembling. "They said Omegas were a drain on resources. Beta Thomas told me. He told me I didn't have a place at the pack house." He locked the door. The temperature in the room plummeted again, but this time, it wasn't the weather. Kale's jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. His golden eyes flared, the pupils dilating until they were almost entirely black. The raw, primal fury rolling off him was suffocating, a physical pressure that made Alone gasp for air. The Royal Guard behind him instinctively lowered their heads even further, bracing for the explosion. "They left you to die," Kyle stated, his voice devoid of all warmth. "Yes," Alone whispered. The Alpha King stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence was absolute, heavier than the blizzard outside. Then, impossibly, Kale's expression softened. The lethal predator vanished, replaced by a man looking at her with something akin to awe. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so she wouldn't flinch, and gently cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed over a faded bruise near her jawline. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't identify. 15 wolves. The king and his entire royal guard. You used your last wood, your last food, your last strength for strangers who could have torn you apart. You were freezing. Elone replied simply, confused by his reaction. What else was I supposed to do? Yes, Kale murmured, his thumb still resting against her cheek. He dropped his hand, turning to face his kneeling guard. We owe this Omega our lives. He turned back to Elone, his expression hardening back into the Alpha King, and by ancient law, Elone Thornheart. A life debt to the crown is repaid in full. Whatever you want, wealth, protection, a place in the capital, it's yours. Elone stared at him, her mind blank. Asterisk, anything. She could ask for money. She could ask to leave Silver Pine forever. She could ask for a real home, but before she could speak, a massive crack split the air above them loud as a cannon shot. The thick wooden beams supporting the center of her roof groaned, splintering under the impossible weight of accumulated snow. Dust and frozen debris showered down upon them. The roof is collapsing, the auburn-haired woman Valencia shouted. Leaping to her feet, another deafening crack echoed through the tiny space. The ceiling bowed inward, groaning like a dying beast. Move, Kale roared. The cabin descended into utter chaos. The royal guard scrambled for the exit, grabbing the few meager supplies Elone possessed. Valencia snatched her mother's faded lavender shawl and a tattered blanket. Another wolf, a massive man named Garrett, shoved his shoulder against the doorframe, bracing his formidable strength against the groaning wood to keep the exit clear. Elone stood frozen, her eyes wide, staring at the sagging ceiling. This was her entire world. Her miserable, freezing, lonely world. But it was all she had. Every memory of her mother, every shred of her pathetic existence, was anchored to these rotting floorboards. Elone. Kyle's voice cut through her paralysis like a whip. Before she could process his command, strong bare arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her bodily off the ground. Kale crushed her against his chest, his skin radiating impossible heat, and sprinted for the door. The heavy roof beams snapped with a final, agonizing shriek. Kale hit the doorway at a dead run, carrying Elone into the teeth of the blizzard. The cold slapped her with blinding force, stealing the breath from her lungs. She buried her face against the solid wall of his chest, her thin clothes offering zero protection against the onslaught. Behind them, the cabin collapsed. The sound was thunderous, a sickening crash of wood, stone, and the massive weight of snow. Elone felt the vibration rumble through Kale's chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent sob tearing at her throat. Gone. It was all gone. Don't look back, Kale ordered, his voice vibrating against her ear. Rough and absolute. We're not dying today. They plunged into the whiteout, the wind of physical force trying to push them back into the ruin. Valencia shouted something over the gale, pointing toward a faint dark line in the distance, the dense pine forest that bordered Silver Pine territory. It was their only hope for cover. They ran, 15 naked werewolves and one terrified Omega, fleeing into a storm that wanted them dead. The snow was thigh-deep in places, slowing their progress to an agonizing slog. Alone shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard, her jaw ached. She was a liability. She was dead weight. Asterisk. Beta Thomas was right. She was going to kill them all. Put me down, she gasped, struggling weakly against Kale's iron grip. I can walk. You're wasting energy. Quiet Kyle snapped, his arms tightening around her. His body was a furnace, the only thing keeping her from freezing solid. You're not walking in this. You'd be buried in 5 minutes. Garrett, the massive man who'd held the door, plowed through the drifts ahead of them, creating a trench with his sheer bulk. He found at first a large hollow where several ancient pines had fallen, their massive snow-covered trunks forming a crude three-sided shelter. The guard poured into the depression, their bare bodies steaming in the frigid air. It wasn't warm, but it broke the relentless assault of the wind. Kale sat alone down carefully in the center of the hollow. He immediately positioned his large frame between her and the open side, shielding her from the worst of the elements. The others formed a tight circle around them, creating a living, breathing windbreak. Everyone accounted for, Kale demanded, his chest heaving. All present. Your Majesty. Valencia confirmed. Her teeth clicking together. Her lips were a dangerous shade of blue. But we won't last an hour like this. The temperature is dropping. We shift. Garrett grunted, his massive arms wrapped around his chest. Fur is better insulation. We pile up like in the cabin. The Omega can't shift with us. A petite blonde woman named Lyra pointed out, her voice trembling. Her wolf is too weak. She'll be crushed in the middle, and she needs the heat the most. Then we shift around her. Kale decided, his voice brooking no argument. We create a den. She stays human in the center. We provide the heat. Move. The transformation rippled through the guard with military precision. On B1. The naked men and women dropped to all fours, their bodies twisting and expanding into massive wolves. They arranged themselves strategically, the largest wolves forming the outer wall. Facing the storm, the smaller ones pressing inward, Kale was the last to shift. He knelt before Elone, his golden eyes locking onto hers. Despite the desperate situation, his chaza held a strange, fierce tenderness. I won't let you freeze. Elone, he said softly. The words meant only for her. He shifted. The giant black wolf materialized, his fur thick and gleaming despite the snow. He lay down directly against her, his massive body a solid wall of heat. The others closed in, piling on top of one another, forming a densa, furry dome with Elone at its heart. It should have been terrifying. 15 apex predators, their jaws inches from her face, their combined weight pressing in on her. She should have felt suffocated, trapped. Instead, as the collective body heat of the royal guard began to warm the small pocket of air, Elone felt something she hadn't experienced in 14 years. Safe. She was buried alive under a mountain of werewolves. And it was the safest she'd ever felt. The air grew warm and humid with their breath. The wind howling outside became a muffled, distant threat. Tears, hot and unexpected, pricked her eyes. She tried to swallow them down, embarrassed by her weakness. But the exhaustion, the terror, the sheer overwhelming relief broke through her defenses. She turned her face into the thick, dark fur of Kale's neck and wept silently. She cried for her destroyed cabin, for her mother, for the 14 years of loneliness, and for the impossible kindness of these strangers. The black wolf let out a low, rumbling sound deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl. but a vibration of comfort. He turned his massive head, his wet nose nuzzling her cheek, his rough tongue gently licking away a tear that had escaped around her. The other wolves shifted closer, making soft, chuffing sounds of reassurance. They were treating her not as an omega, not as a burden, but as one of their own, as pack, rest. Asterisk, a voice echoed in her mind. It was deep, varm, and unmistakably Kale's. Elon gasped, her eyes snapping open in the dim light of their makeshift den. Asterisk, you've done enough. Brave Omega. Asterisk, Kale's mental voice continued, soothing and steady. Asterisk, let us protect you for a while. How she projected back, stunned by the clarity of the connection. I'm not, we're not. Asterisk alpha privilege. Asterisk, he replied, amusement coloring his tone. Asterisk, I can speak mind to mind with any wolf in my presence. Now stop thinking. Sleep. The storm will end when it ends. We'll survive it together. I promise. Alone wanted to argue, wanted to stay vigilant, to keep herself small and unnoticed. But the warmth was intoxicating, and the exhaustion was bone deep. She curled her fingers into Kale's thick fur, closed her eyes, and let the darkness take her. She woke to an eerie, profound silence. The wind had stopped. The howling had ceased. Elone is still, her muscles stiff. Immediately, the wolves around her began to untangle themselves. They had stayed in position all night, a living shield against the lethal cold. Kale lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the opening of their den. He carefully extracted himself from the pile, padded to the edge, and looked out. Then he shifted back to human form. The storm has passed, he announced, his voice tight. But the damage, on the B1. The guard shifted and crawled out. Elone followed, clutching her mother's shawl tightly. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The forest was a landscape of devastation. Snowdrifts were piled higher than her head. Ancient pines had been snapped like twigs, and in the distance, where her cabin had stood, there was only a smooth, unbroken mound of white. It was completely gone. Every physical trace of her existence in Silver Pine territory had been erased. I'm sorry, Lyra said softly, appearing beside her, now dressed in a makeshift toga she'd fashioned from a blanket before the cabin fell. I know it wasn't much, but it was yours. It was all I had. Elone whispered, her voice hollow. Everything my mother left me. Not everything, Valencia said, holding out a bundle. It was the lavender shawl and the tattered blanket she'd managed to grab. We saved what we could. Elone took the bundle with trembling hands, pressing the shawl to her face. It still smelled faintly of lavender. It was something. What now, Finn? The sandy-haired young wolf asked, looking at Kale. He too was wrapped in a blanket. We're stranded in hostile territory, with no supplies, no real shelter, and no way to contact the capital. We walk, Kale said simply, his golden eyes scanning the horizon. The forward outpost is a 2-day trek northeast. We can make it in wolf form in half the time. And her Garrett jerked his chin toward Elone. She can't keep pace in wolf form. Her wolf is too small. And she certainly can't walk 2 days through chest-deep snow. The guard fell silent. Every eye turned to Elone. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She was the weak link again. The burden they'd have to drag behind them. She straightened her spine, refusing to let them see her break. I'll manage, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'll stay here, find a cave, Wait for rescue. You go. You don't need to slow down for me. Absolutely not, Kale said flatly. The Alpha command was back hard and unyielding. Your Majesty. Be reasonable. Valencia argued. Though her tone was respectful. She'll slow us down. We could make the outpost in half a day if we run with her. It'll take 3 days minimum. We have no food. We'll freeze before we get there. Then we carry her. Kyle said, That's insane. Finn shook his head. Even Garrett would be exhausted by the end of it. Then we have 2 liabilities instead of 1. We could take turns. Lyra suggested. Rotate who carries her. Distribute the burden. Asterisk. The burden. Asterisk. Alone bit the inside of her cheek so hard, she tasted blood. She hated this. She hated being the problem they had to solve. I have another idea, Kale said, his voice dropping an octave, but Alone has to agree to it. He stepped toward her, ignoring the snow crunching under his bare feet. He stopped just inches away, his towering presence forcing her to look up into those intense golden eyes. There's a way to make this work, he said quietly, so only she could hear. A way to keep you safe, keep you warm, and allow us to move at full speed. How alone, he asked, her heart pounding. You become part of the pack, Kyle said. Officially, right now, I perform a temporary pack bond. It will link you to us, let you draw on our strength. You'll be able to keep pace with us in wolf form because you'll have alpha-level power backing you. Elone's mouth fell open. That's impossible. Omegas can't bond to an alpha's primary pack. The power differential is exactly why it will work. Kale interrupted. My power will stabilize yours, give you what you need to survive. But it comes with a cost. What cost? His gaze was unflinching. You'd be bound to me, to my pack, for as long as the bond holds. You'd feel my emotions, my presence. You'd be compelled to stay close. And breaking the bond, he hesitated. Breaking it could be painful. And if I refuse, then we carry you, Kyle said simply. And we move slowly, because I refuse to leave you behind. The choice is yours. Alone. But I'm asking you to trust me. Trust us. Let us help you. Alone looked around at the 14 wolves watching her. The royal guard, the most elite warriors in the kingdom, and they were waiting for her decision like it mattered, like she mattered. If I agree, she said slowly, her voice trembling. What happens after we reach the outpost? That's up to you, Kale replied, his expression softening. The bond can be severed once you're safe. You can return to your pack, or he paused, his golden eyes burning into hers, or you can stay with us. Join the royal pack, officially. You would never be alone again. Alone. Never cold. Never hungry. Never abandoned. It was too much. It was a fantasy she'd never even dared to dream. Why, she whispered, a tear escaping down her bruised cheek. Why do you care so much about one broken Omega? Kyle reached out, gently wiping the tear away with his thumb. Because in all my years as king, he said, his voice raw with sincerity, I've never met anyone with a heart as pure as yours. You saved us without hesitation, without expectation, without fear. That kind of courage, it's rarer than any power, any title. And I'll be damned if I let the world break you. Alone looked into those impossible gold eyes and saw only truth. She was terrified. She was exhausted. But for the first time in her life, she didn't want to run. Okay. She breathed. I trust you. Kale's smile was like the sunrise breaking through clouds. Then let's begin. The snow-draped forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Kyle stepped back, his expression shifting from gentle protector to solemn king. He gestured, and the 14 members of the royal guard moved with practiced synchronicity, forming a wide, perfect circle around them. The morning sun finally pierced the heavy gray clouds, casting long, stark shadows across the pristine snow and illuminating the circle of warriors. They stood tall despite the bitter cold and their lack of proper clothing, their faces set in expressions of profound reverence. This is an ancient ritual, Kyle began, his voice dropping into a resonant cadence that seemed to vibrate in Alone's very bones. Older than the kingdoms, older than the rigid hierarchies we've built. In the beginning, all wolves were equal. Alphas, betas, omegas. We survived together, or we died alone. This bond honors that truth. Alone's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt impossibly small, standing in the center of the ring, a frail, bruised Omega surrounded by legends. What do I need to do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly in the crisp air. Give me your hands. KL instructed softly. She extended them. Her fingers were blue with cold, scraped from hauling wolves. Kyle took them in his palms were broad, calloused, and radiated a heat that immediately began to thaw her frozen joints. The physical contact sent a jolt through her system, not quite electric, but a deep, resonant thrum. Asterisk, recognition. Asterisk, her inner wolf whispered, stirring from its perpetual cringe. Destiny. Elone Thornheart. Kale intoned, his golden eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away. Do you willingly accept this bond? Do you offer your trust to this pack? Your strength to our cause? Your heart to our protection? The words carried a weight far heavier than mere survival. This wasn't just a magical lifeline to get her through the snow. It was an invitation to belong, to choose, for the first time in her life, to be part of something greater than her own misery. I do, she whispered, the words puffing white in the air. Do you swear to honor the pack, to stand with us in darkness and light, to share in our burdens as we share in yours? Tears pricked her eyes again. Asterisk, share in her burdens. Asterisk, the concept was entirely foreign. I do, she repeated, her voice steadying. Kyle's grip on her hands tightened. The air around them began to hum a low, barely audible vibration that made the snow at their feet swirl in tiny eddies. Then, by the power vested in me as Alpha King, by the ancient laws that bind our kind, I claim you as pack, Kale declared, his voice booming across the silent forest. I offer you my strength, my protection, my loyalty. What threatens you threatens me. What hurts you hurts me. We are bound from this moment forward, until death or choice parts us. The instant the last word left his lips, the world exploded. Power slammed into Alone like a physical blow, a tidal wave of golden light and raw energy. It wasn't her power. It was his. Alpha strength, pure and unadulterated, poured into her system through their joined hands. She gasped, her knees buckling under the sheer force of it. But Kale held her upright, his grip unyielding. His eyes were no longer just gold. They blazed with a molten internal light, the pupils completely swallowed by the glow. Don't fight it, his voice commanded, not in the air, but directly inside her mind. The alpha compulsion was absolute, pinning her consciousness in place. Let it in. Let it change you. Ilone had no choice. The power flooded her veins like liquid fire, searing away the cold, the exhaustion, the years of deep-seated weakness. Her inner wolf, the small, timid creature that had cowered for 14 years, suddenly roared to life. It grew, expanded, gorged itself on the alpha magic until it was no longer a frightened shadow, but something magnificent and proud simultaneously. Her mind expanded. She felt the others. 14 distinct presences bloomed in her consciousness like stars igniting in a dark sky. She felt Valencia's sharp, analytical intelligence, Garrett's steady, immovable strength, Lyra's gentle, fierce warmth, Finn's bright, playful energy. Each member of the Royal Guard became a point of light, connected to her by shimmering threads of the pack bond, and at the center of that constellation, blazing like a supernova, was Kale. His presence in her mind was enormous, an all-consuming fire. She felt his power. Yes, but also the raw, unfiltered rush of his emotions, his fierce protectiveness, his unexpected, profound tenderness, his absolute, unshakable certainty that she was worth saving. It was too much. The sensory overload threatened to shatter her fragile psyche. Ilone felt herself fracturing under the weight of 15 minds and the Alpha King's soul. Asterisk, stay with me. Asterisk, Kale's mental voice cut through the chaos. An anchor in the storm. Asterisk, you can handle this. You're stronger than you know. I can't. She gasped mentally. Panic rising. Asterisk, you already have. Asterisk, he insisted, his presence wrapping around hers like a protective shield. Asterisk, you survived 14 years alone. You saved 15 lives without hesitation. You faced down an Alpha King. This power doesn't make you strong, Ilone. It just reveals what was always there. His absolute belief in her stabilized the spiraling energy. The fire in her veins began to cool, settling into a deep, steady warmth that radiated from her core. The cacophony of presences in her mind shifted from overwhelming noise to a comfortable, harmonious hum, and her inner wolf stood tall. Ilone opened her eyes. She hadn't realized she'd closed them. The blinding light had faded. Kale was smiling down at her, his eyes back to their normal, piercing gold. Welcome to the pack. Ilone, he said softly, releasing one of her hands to gently brush a stray, snow-dampened curl from her forehead. She tried to speak, but her throat tightened painfully. The emotion was too vast: joy, relief, and the terrifying vulnerability of finally belonging. After 14 years of being invisible, of being utterly alone, she suddenly had 15 wolves occupying her mind, their warmth and acceptance washing over her like a physical embrace. I know, Kale murmured, reading the overwhelm in her eyes, feeling it through the bond. He pulled her gently into his chest, wrapping his arms around her. I know. Let it out. So she did. She buried her face against the Alpha King's bare chest, surrounded by the protective circle of the Royal Guard, and cried. She wept for every lonely night in the freezing cabin, for every cruel sneer from Beta Thomas, for every moment she'd truly believed she was nothing. And when the tears finally slowed, leaving her exhausted but inexplicably light, she felt Lyra's mental voice brush against hers, soft and reassuring. Asterisk, we've got you. Little sister. Ilone pulled back from Kyle, swiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. She felt different. The bone-deep ache of malnutrition and cold was gone, replaced by a thrumming vitality she'd never known. Are you all right? Valencia asked, stepping forward, offering a rare, genuine smile. I feel strong, Elone admitted, looking down at her hands. The scrapes were still there, but they no longer hurt. Good, Kyle said, his tone shifting back to business, though his eyes remained warm. Because we have a long run ahead of us. We need to reach the forward outpost before the weather turns again. Can she shift? Garrett asked, eyeing Elone critically. The bond gives her power. But the shift itself, I think so, Elone said slowly. Before the bond, shifting had been an agonizing, exhausting process she avoided unless necessary. Now her wolf was practically clawing at the surface. Eager to run. Try it, Kale encouraged, stepping back to give her space. We'll be right here. Elone closed her eyes and reached for her wolf. It didn't resist. It surged forward like a tidal wave. The transformation was instantaneous and painless. Bones rearranged. Muscles expanded. Fur erupted in a fluid motion. 1 second. She was a small, shivering woman in thin clothes. The next, she stood on 4 paws, her perspective shifting drastically. But she wasn't her old wolf. She was larger, significantly more muscular. Hefua, previously a dull, mousy gray, was now a brilliant, gleaming silver white, tipped with the faintest hints of pale gold. Her paws were broad, designed for running across snow, and her senses were razor sharp. She looked up. The guard was staring at her in stunned silence. Goddess, Valencia breathed. She's beautiful. Kale shifted the massive black wolf, replacing the man. He stepped closer, his golden eyes filled with pride. Asterisk, how do you feel, Times? His voice echoed clearly in her mind. Elone shook her silver coat, sending a spray of loose snow flying. She felt the pack bond thrumming in her chest, feeding her strength, anchoring her to the 15 warriors around her. Asterisk, I feel ready. Asterisk, she projected back, her mental voice clear and strong. Kyle let out a short, sharp bark of approval. Then let's run. He took off a black streak against the white snow. Elone didn't hesitate. Her new instincts took over Ake, and she lunged after him, her powerful legs eating up the distance with a grace she'd never possessed. The royal guard fell in behind them, a perfectly synchronized unit, their mental presences a comforting chorus in her mind. They ran not just for survival, but for the sheer, intoxicating joy of being alive, of being pack. For the first time in her life, Elone wasn't running away. She was running towards something, and she wasn't running alone. 5 takeaway points. Point 1. The world will dismiss you for the very thing that makes you irreplaceable. They told Elone she was dead weight, a drain on resources not worth the heat or space. But when 15 dying wolves collapsed at her door, she was the only one who knew how to save them. She used her last firewood, her last food, her mother's only shawl, the skills they mocked her for, the care, the patience. The refusal to give up on the broken became the reason a king and his entire guard survived the night. Point 2. True strength isn't louder or bigger. It's what you do when no one's watching and there's nothing in it for you. Elone could have shut that door. She could have let the storm take them and saved herself. But she dragged 150 pounds of frozen wolf across her threshold, then 14 more, and spent the night keeping them alive with nothing but her hands and her heart. That choice made in the dark with no reward in sight is what separated her from everyone who ever called her weak. Point 3. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the doorway to everything you were always meant to become. Beta Thomas locked her out to die. The cabin she'd clung to for 14 years collapsed into nothing. But in that frozen hollow, buried under a mountain of wolves who refused to leave her behind, Alone felt something she'd never known: safety. The storm that was supposed to kill her became the moment she finally found her pack. Point 4. Belonging isn't something you beg for. It's something you choose when someone sees you and says you're worth fighting for. Kale didn't offer Alone charity. He offered her a bond, a place in his pack, alpha-level power, and the promise that she'd never be cold or hungry or alone again. But he didn't force it. He asked her to trust him. And when she said yes, she wasn't choosing survival. She was choosing to stop running and finally believe she deserved to be seen. Point 5. You don't need permission to be strong. You just need to stop believing the people who told you that you weren't. For 14 years, Elone carried Beta Thomas's voice in her head, weak, worthless, prey. But the moment she pulled 15 dying wolves from a blizzard, the moment she stood in that ancient circle and accepted the bond, her inner wolf didn't just wake up. It roared. The power didn't make her strong. It revealed what had been there all along. Buried under years of being told she was nothing,